She was a star.
She had it all. She was a daredevil.
She was definitely a motorhead and a speed freak.
Earned the nickname the fastest woman on earth.
All successful women know there was someone before them, a trailblazer who pushed the limits and created a path for future generations to establish new thresholds for success. The headlines of their era may be faded, but the influence remains. During the post-World War II transportation renaissance, one amazing woman impacted all facets of the industry. Fearless and determined, gifted with skill and charm, she was undaunted by the sexism of the times. From aviation to NASCAR, advertising boardrooms, and NASA, her feats were admired around the world. Everything she accomplished had a lasting impact. New heroines picked up the mantle, but there was only one First Lady of firsts. This is the story of Betty Skelton, Boundless.
The first thing that somebody would say, well, what makes you tick? And I would think, what a question. My heart makes me tick, and it's my heart that makes me do these things. Everyone is built a little differently, and my heart and my will and my desires are mixed up with challenge.
Take a good look, number 10, Air 310, take one.
Take a good look, starring Ernie Kovacs.
And now, panel, if you're ready, let's try to identify our first guest who has been prominent in the news, either currently or in the past.
It's an amazing story.
Betty had it going for her, first this, first that. People couldn't get enough.
She is extremely important to the story of Corvette.
It was a classic case of outperforming your gender.
Please, madam, were you disguised as a man on any occasion?
No, I was not.
Betty is so good at dealing with men. She's not fazed by them, and they're not fazed by her.
Bill France connecting her with Corvette and the racing heritage and history at Daytona, it was the key to all of this.
It's just not as common to find someone doing so many different things. So I think that makes the story even more special.
She always believed the competition should be equal.
Did fear have anything to do with it?
No, it does not.
I've never seen her nervous.
I said, do you ever sweat? She says, all the time, but I try not to show it.
Did flight have anything to do with it?
Mm-hmm. There's a great possibility.
Flight.
Betty Skelton was a stellar aerobatic pilot in the years when there weren't that many women flying.
This woman drove race cars and airplanes and on the salt flats and all kinds of different stuff.
I don't think any other woman in history has had the kind of impact she had on aviation, automobiles, space, advertising. I'm hard-pressed to think of anyone that could quite match her.
It's shocking that we don't know her name.
I probably shouldn't tell you, but I soloed when I was 12, and it wasn't quite legal then, so I couldn't tell anybody.
Betty was born in Pensacola, Florida. So she was right near the Naval Air Station at Pensacola, where the Navy trained their pilots. From the time she was a child, she saw airplanes and she saw pilots every day. Her father was a railroad man, but he always had an interest in aviation. But he also had an interest in automobiles. So that figures in later in her life. So he was eager to give them opportunities.
Her dad never told her not to do it. You're not supposed to be in it. That wasn't his vocabulary. You do your best and do your simulating so you don't crash and be safe.
Her father, I think, built her first airplane for her, so she had that kind of encouragement. She took no prisoners and said, that's what I'm going to do.
There's American star Betty Skelton, who literally dances on air in her tiny plane.
The local JC's club was having some sort of an event at the airport, and someone says, we need somebody to do aerobatics. And someone says to her father, maybe Betty could do that. And he says, well, she doesn't know how to fly aerobatics. And lo and behold, there's another pilot who shows up who is an aerobatic pilot. And he says, oh, I can teach her how to do a loop and a roll. And she just takes to it.
A perfect touchdown is followed by a big hand for the 22-year-old glamour girl of the show.
She wasn't just, this girl that had an airplane that went up and flew. She really knew what she was doing.
A 3-time women's aerobatic champion, Betty and her plane Little Stinker formed an iconic team. The highlight of her performances was the inverted ribbon cut, flying your plane upside down a few feet off the ground and then snipping a handheld ribbon with your wheel. Spectators were stunned to see a woman perform what was considered a man's trick. But performing that move almost led to disaster.
When she makes that first run, just as she gets to the ribbon and is passing underneath, her engine quits. And now she's just a few feet off the ground.
She had the wherewithal to snap roll the plane and wheels touched down and she landed safely. And yet it scared her so much that she walked the length of the airfield afterwards just to kind of collect herself.
She goes up and practices an hour and an hour. The local air shows in Florida that she starts flying to and being the star of, and she's just invited to more and more of them. I know by 1948, they're having a Betty Skelton Day.
Betty chose that day to go for a land speed record. The crowd watched as she borrowed a friend's P-51. Her attempt became the stuff of a legend.
You fly 4 passes. There were 2 rules. You couldn't go over a certain altitude, and you had to land where you took off. And just as I was going by the pylon on the last pass, and I had the record set, the engine blew up, and there was a little fire.
She has just enough time to consider her options because it's not out of control at this point.
And I pulled up to over 3,000 feet to bail out. The tower told me to bail out.
Yeah, everyone's saying, bail out. She says, yeah, I could bail out, but I'm not a great swimmer. I'm over at Tampa Bay. And this plane belongs to my friend, and he lent it to me. And if I can bring this plane back.
So I did not eject and landed without an engine at MacDill Air Force Base.
Well, Betty was really funny when I'd ask her, have you ever flown the P-51? She goes, yeah, I did, and then I was flying over Tampa Bay and I had an engine failure and I had to dead stick it in. I was like, oh my God, I can't even imagine having to do that. And she was very matter of fact about it, no drama.
Near misses didn't deter Betty from going for more records, but she did it her way.
And went up to 29,000 feet or something like that. It was about 53 degrees below outside. Oh, I haven't mentioned, I usually fly barefooted, and my feet darn near froze to death.
She knew the secret that you never show weakness. You always show strength, and she was really, really good at that.
And before I got out of the airplane, I would unzip, throw the coverall off, and I would get out in a dress and have my shoes handy, my heels to put on, because I felt women should create nice and good impression of women who do what most consider masculine things. I think it's very important. No matter what you're doing, you remain a lady.
She wanted to be perceived as feminine. In the earlier years when women started flying, it was always, it's not the place for a woman. They're going to be covered with oil and it's a masculine thing.
Betty was always very put together, and that was also part of how she gained respect. She didn't get out a sweaty mess, even though we're all sweaty messes after we get out of the airplane. She was somehow able to pull off a much more put together look, but that was part of her power, and it was important.
Betty seemed to have an innate understanding of how to project herself and marketing. And she did say originally she wasn't always excited talking to the press, but it became a natural thing for her. And because she was so interested in aviation, she was drawn into all these other aspects so that she was writing for Flying Magazine. She had a monthly column there, and she had a radio show. She was accepted by the editors of magazines who wanted her to be writing for them because she did bring a feminine part of you, but never let go of the passion of airplanes.
She had a sense of everything she did and the influence it had because she was visionary and she was very attuned to what was happening in society and her impact on it and how people related to her and reacted to her.
Betty didn't hesitate to advocate for change in aviation. She wanted to test her skills against all pilots, whether female or male. Never waiting for others to take the lead, Betty created opportunities encouraging other women to follow. Then, at age 25, With little left to prove, she shocked the aviation industry when she announced the end of her aerobatic career.
That's the fascinating part about her, is that she does sense when I've done all I can do here. I've had this jam-packed life, and it's been great, but that same year, they have a terrible crash at the National Air Races, and they closed down the air races for years. And she has that self-awareness and the confidence to just say, all right, I'm going to drop back, and then we'll see where I go from there.
Destiny played a hand in all facets of Betty Skelton's life. So it wasn't shocking when her decision to end her competitive flying career led to a different opportunity. She traded in her airplane control wheel and climbed behind the steering wheel of a race car, a move that impacted the automotive industry forever and continues to open doors for women today.
You are about to meet a very unusual woman. A woman who has driven automobiles to world speed records, flown airplanes to world championships, manhandled boats of all types, and parachutes for the sport of it. The lady has established more aviation and automotive records combined than any other person in history. Miss Betty Skelton.
You're about to see a very unusual...
Having won 3 feminine aerobatic championships, she really had nowhere else to go. And what do? Come back and win it again next year? And there wasn't anything for her. She couldn't join the airlines. But she's never going to give up flying. She finds something else. It's easy to do charter flights.
I had a charter flight to fly 3 famous race drivers for Bill France Sr., who then was just getting NASCAR started. We started talking back and forth over the intercom, and he said, how would you like to come down to Daytona for Speed Week? And I said, well, what is Speed Week?
Every February, NASCAR would organize something called NASCAR Speed Weeks. It's just an opportunity to just prove the performance of your car. And whether you're a manufacturer or a race car builder or whatever.
He explained to me what NASCAR was doing with speed in Daytona. And I said, well, sure, I'd love to come, but I'd have to have a sponsor. 6 months later, he called and said, I have you a sponsor. And would you come down, drive a car on the beach? And I said, sure, why not?
The beach run was an attempt to establish a 2-way record average speed on Daytona Beach.
It was important at the time, proving that you had the fastest car, the most durable car, the car that could win, put a mindset into the American public. That was the best car out there because it could defeat all the other brands.
And it was challenging, usually because of prevailing winds or tides. Going one direction might be totally different from going in the other direction.
The tide would bring in what we call tide pools. And you'd be going like gangbusters down the beach, and suddenly you'd see a tide pool coming up. And you'd have to watch your course very carefully so that you didn't go into the little water holes.
Stars of that era included men like Lee Petty, Fireball Roberts, and Buck Baker.
The first time I drove on Daytona, I didn't know I was even going to need a helmet, so I didn't own one. Maury said, here, I've worn this for many years and banged it all up. Why don't you use it? So he loaned me his helmet, and when I was all finished, he said, well, I want you to have it. You just keep it.
Maury Rose was a tough critic. She had to prove herself to Maury Rose, and she did. She did that repeatedly with various people.
Bill France Sr., the founder of NASCAR, championed Betty's early journey into auto racing as she became the first AAA licensed female race car driver.
I've heard many times that Bill France Sr. was very open-minded.
It couldn't have changed if there weren't people that were willing to change it. Bill France thought, hey, here's a woman, let's bring her in. He was a blue-collar guy, grassroots guy. If you grew up on a farm, the women worked just as hard as the men. I thought it was extremely progressive back in the day.
Part of it may have been about the spectacle of a woman driving a race car. I believe Bill's respect for Betty, his knowledge of what she had already accomplished in her life, that he knew there was more to Betty being behind the wheel of any automobile.
Bill France Sr. was a smart businessman, and there's been others like him. If you do something different, it's going to grow your business.
Bill was so impressed with Betty and her credentials that he recommended her initially to Dodge, and she started with Dodge in '54.
She immediately makes headlines. She breaks a speed record right away.
Betty took advantage of her short time with Dodge, shattering stereotypes while proving a woman's capabilities behind the wheel of any vehicle. But a single moment at the Dodge Proving Grounds opened a door for the next generation of female driver to enter the hallowed ground of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Betty was the first person to test an Indy car, a Jack McGrath Indy car, and she did not attempt to qualify for the race or anything, but she was the first woman to even drive an Indy car. And that was a pretty big breakthrough.
They wouldn't let a woman go out and drive on a racetrack. It was unheard of. If she had got a little practice on it, I think she'd have been impressive. I think she had done very, very well, like Indianapolis, Detroit, all those racetracks.
Despite her success, Betty wasn't content. She eyed a new opportunity that eventually made her part of an automotive legacy.
Then I became a little restless, and I got very interested in the Corvette.
Now touring America's principal cities, General Motors' 1953 Motorama is attracting crowds like this one of 55,000 New Yorkers who throng to the Waldorf Astoria on opening day. But the high points of the show to most visitors are the customized cars, which the various divisions have created especially for the show. This Chevrolet Corvette and the other customized models are not for sale yet.
It all stems back to World War II. We had soldiers who were 18, 19 years old, leaving America, going overseas, and saw something that they'd never seen the likes of in America, which was the European sports car. Harley Earl and a gentleman named Maurice Ollie, who was working at GM, that came together and understood the need for a major American auto manufacturer to build something that would rival those MGs that were being imported by the soldiers that were coming back. And that was the birth of Corvette. It was tough to get Corvette to take here in America.
When she started driving it, it changed everything. Women fell right in because they had somebody they could cheer for.
Going to a race or listening to a race on the radio to hear, and here's Betty Skelton driving a Corvette.
Betty Skelton upholds the honor of women drivers everywhere with her record-breaking Corvette.
There's another woman stepping into a man's role and showing America that she can do it just as good as any of those men out there.
She was a different woman. About everything that she ever touched and did, she did it better than the rest of us. She didn't need a lot of training. She was ready to race.
Well, it shows how competitive she was. If she was going to drive cars, she was going to drive what she thought were the best cars. She paid a lot of attention to what Zora Arkus Duntov was doing.
Zora Arkus Duntov was a genius racer, engineer, and marketer who turned the Corvette into the most respected high-powered sports car in the world.
Zora always had what was going to be best to develop Corvette to what it needed to be, and what was best to show the public the best light of Corvette. So it didn't scare him to have someone like Betty Skelton right next to him. He knew that if there was a woman out there that was going to do the same thing he was going to do with Corvette, which was push it to its limit and make it the best car it was going to be, it was Betty that was going to do it.
Zora treated Betty like family, and that's different. He was back 100%.
He sized people up based on what he thought their potential was. He turned out to be a magnificent leader for the Corvette. The Corvette wouldn't exist today if it weren't for Zora.
This was an era of automobile titans at General Motors, and three men made history with their work on the Corvette. Duntov, the father of the Corvette, Harley Earl, the first head of design at GM, and legendary designer Bill Mitchell. No one at GM was more powerful, and Betty worked right beside them.
Well, if you're going to play a game, you want to play with the big boys. I mean, you want to get with the top people in an industry.
Betty had a rather charming, flirtatious personality. She knew how to play the game.
Harley Earl and Bill Mitchell were no strangers to having women working alongside of them. So having Zora working directly with Betty in essentially an engineering role, driving the car, giving feedback, and the fact that Zora would acknowledge her importance almost immediately told Harley and Bill that, okay, we need to pay attention to this, and we need to allow her into that inner circle.
Part of the original Corvette team, Betty's success encouraged women to drive.
1950s America still held on to a lot of antiquated ideology about men's roles and women's roles. To have Betty Skelton go out there and essentially slough those off as she stepped foot into Corvette. There was some glamour behind it. She became a bit of a celebrity. Oh, there's Betty Skelton.
They wanted someone that knew what in the hell they were doing behind the wheel of an automobile, and she sure delivered.
Betty broke records in all the Corvettes she drove on the beach, from the team car to Duntov's prototypes.
The speed, I think was somewhere around 143, 44 miles an hour, the average speed. It was a new record for women.
The conditions that day didn't warrant any of them averaging over 150 miles an hour. That's the one they really wanted to go for, because that was such a magical milestone to establish a sports car on the market, that it could go 150 miles an hour. That was a lot of speed back then in 1956. Betty didn't think the cars were equal. She was so competitive. I think she felt that she could have beaten the other two guys.
I've seen that story told over the years when it's just Finch and Duntov. Why wasn't she in there? You kind of know the reason. People thought, well, you don't want a woman in there. It'll denigrate the guy.
Unfortunately, the sanctioning body wouldn't allow her to race directly against men. But when she set speed records on the beach alongside Zora and John Fitch, every woman in America that knew she had done that knew that Betty Skelton was doing something that only men had done before, and she just broke that barrier.
She was good, but she was not allowed in because she was a woman, so that just shows the times that she was living in.
Betty Skelton's NASCAR records on Daytona Beach earned her the respect of her peers, but not the opportunity to race head-to-head with the men on the racetrack. Although frustrated, she remained focused on the opportunities that allowed her to continue to forge a new path for women, even if she had to create those chances herself.
I can tell you, because I've heard it numerous times in my career, and I suspect that she heard it maybe or knew it existed. As much as there would be advocates for people that wanted to give you an opportunity that respected you, there is an innate in most men that they feel responsible if a woman were to get killed in a race car.
1956, 1957, Chevrolet, seeing the opportunity of having Betty behind the wheel of a Corvette, working with the AAA and NASCAR and all of those groups, and saying, we need to put Betty at the front of the pack in a pace car, something that's going to get notoriety, having her out there. And the design studio comes up with the idea of having a gold Corvette.
My beloved gold Corvette. It was a gold car, all metallic gold, really beautiful. And had pearlescent leather inside with gold belts and buckles. And everything was just gorgeous. It even had a little small foot platform out of gold where you put your feet, and naturally I never wore shoes in it. For a number of years, paced many races throughout the country.
That car meant so much to her because it was created by Harley Earl and Bill Mitchell, people that she really looked up to and respected.
Pacing races, driving around at the races, doing whatever she was going to do, she would be in this gold Corvette. It makes a huge statement about how important Betty was to the brand Corvette.
It's going to make a big statement. It's going to get publicity. It's a good business decision to put her in the pace car. But she's not going to die. But she could die if we put her in a race car.
She can't be in the race And she's not happy about that, but she doesn't make a big deal about it. Because, you know, what else can I do? Well, I can drive the pace car, and I'm happy to do that.
Which almost says something interesting on its own, because here's a woman leading the men to start the race. It puts a woman in a whole new light.
We don't know what happened to that car. That is one of the holy grails that the automotive community is still looking for.
It seems to be lost to history. There are stories out there that it likely survived. There are stories out there that it didn't survive.
We have reason to believe it was destroyed. GM put a lot of concept cars in the crusher.
We would love to know where the missing Corvettes from Corvette history have gone. Specifically, we would love to know where that gold Corvette went.
If anyone can find it, that would be one hell of a find.
The gold Corvette spawned more innovative promotions centered around and invented by Betty.
Chevy performed so well that even petite co-driver Betty Skelton finds it easier to drive the world's toughest road.
She entered through the door of Campbell Ewald, which again was Chevrolet's ad agency. And she quickly became the first woman VP at Campbell Ewald, and I believe the first woman VP in the entire advertising industry. And she did not use that as like a token position of any kind. She really used her creative mind, her engineering mind, and so forth, and she came up with a number of performance demonstrations that proved the mettle of Chevrolet in terms of endurance. She organized a 24-hour endurance exercise at Darlington.
She was there running around the track. I crawled in the car with her. I'd push her throttle on her foot and make her run faster. She learned to steer it through the corners. A woman in a Corvette, that brought the level of a Corvette up. And back in them days, it helped sell Corvettes.
Betty's success behind the wheel transcended the automotive pages, touching celebrity and fashion, easing female consumers into the idea of climbing into their own automobile.
Popularity. Betty had it going for her, and going to Dinah Shore. That was the biggest thing for Chevrolet. They just couldn't get enough PR about that, because here's the two girls. See the USA in a Chevrolet.
See the USA in your Chevrolet.
That made them.
I think what Betty brought to the table was opening up this market to people who could see themselves driving a car like the Corvette. She was just a master promoter. She appeared at auto shows around the world.
I think Betty just has this innate ability to communicate with people. She's been doing the technical shows. She's completely comfortable with the technology, and she's super excited about the speed, just about the capabilities of these cars.
And that was a time when women were being accepted for being something other than just an object to admire.
GM saw the value of her. She did narrations for GM, and I thought that was pretty progressive of GM to have a female talking on the technical side, not just like, it's 5.2 liter with a when you go to auto shows, that's what you see, you know.
I remember when I went to the auto show, women were draped over the vehicles. But what I loved about Betty was that she seemed to walk both paths. She looked like a model. She looked like she could be draped over the vehicle, even when she was sitting behind the wheel, but yet she got it done behind the wheel.
She really knew her stuff.
The 50s has that aura of these zippy little race cars and the European race cars and the Le Mans and all these different things. And people are getting excited about the design of these cars. They're really super sexy. They're super fast. And she's right there with that. And so she can just sell that to the American public.
There's Chevrolet's prettiest test driver, Miss Betty Skelton. Betty, what would the woman's angle be?
Well, like Mari, I've done plenty of high-speed driving, but I guess I'm pretty much like other women when it comes to operating a car. I think that women should pay particular attention to how easy a car is to steer. I'd say the best way to find out is to try a couple of U-turns. Try parking it in a tight space.
She had developed this just marvelous ability to communicate without being overbearing, without being too squeaky feminine and cutesy. She just hit the right marks.
There might have been the inference that the Corvette is so easy to drive, even women could do it. You know, there was that sort of, that might have been an attitude. But She never acquiesced to that. You know, she never played the femme fatale.
Actually, it was pretty good. They had a woman in there, and it wasn't just three guys. I thought it was kind of a nice blend of stunt driver Joey Chitwood and Indy 500 Maury Rose and this very accomplished woman. And at least they showed that she was accomplished and not just a woman.
And she's probably saying what she was coached to say is, you know, for a woman, we want you to make sure that the handling, you know, that you can handle the car. And she's rolling her eyes, I'm sure, internally.
She could talk to women, and women could gain confidence from what she said. In one interview, she was talking about driving a car and how women should take the wheel and drive the car, try some U-turns, try to, you know, establish control of the vehicle. Make sure that you are the one that's driving the car and the car's not driving you. And I think a lot of women could take that to heart.
And she's standing up for herself without actually saying it. Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I can't drive fast. She doesn't have to say that.
Mostly, I just drive the car, any place, to see how much fun it is.
I thought the U-turn thing was her own zinger at the end and about feeling the car, because that is the last thing they would expect a woman to say.
But I also sense a degree of frustration. You know, you can see it in her face, and you can see it, you know, it just, the never-ending fight to be recognized as an equal in a world where the machines don't know the difference.
Betty's exploits in the sky and her skill behind the wheel brought her celebrity status. She became one of the most admired women in America. But as a new decade began, there were new frontiers to conquer. Destiny once again found Betty on a path to another challenge.
Take a good look, number 10.
Flight had something to do with it. But were you shot out of anything? Like a cannon or anything like that?
No. Wings.
Your horizons are very small.
Very limited. All I can think of is a flying saucer at this moment.
Try it.
You might...
Are you the wife of an astronaut?
No.
Oh.
Well, what are you going to
do? First, a bit of background. This is Betty Skelton, famous for her test driving skills and holder of the world stunt flying title 3 times, who has just volunteered, and it looks very good, to be the first woman in space.
I don't really know how it started. Someone with Look magazine called me and said that NASA was going to test a woman, and would I be interested in doing it? Probably. I was the first one that kind of gave NASA a kick, although it didn't do much good.
There was a time there in 1959, 60 era, they're making selections for the first astronauts that are going to go into space. There's the huge space race with the Soviets. They're all men. The Air Force and Look magazine and NASA start talking a little bit about, gee, I wonder how a woman would stack up.
When Look magazine went to NASA, Wally Schirra was the man who stepped up. He was one of the Mercury 7 and said, I know exactly who we need to do this. He had met Betty Skelton years before at a hangar in Florida. None of the men that were sitting there in the hangar, they weren't going to go flying in the fog. She flew in a dense fog. She landed on instruments only, pulled up to the hangar, jumped out, and they were all awestruck.
When everyone says, why didn't we have women astronauts? It's because the very first thing they said is, we want military test pilot experience. Women are not allowed to fly military planes. Betty understands right away that she is not going to be an astronaut. But there is an interest to find out, what if women attempt these tests? And that's where it becomes a bit of a PR thing.
She passed some of those tests better than some of those astronauts did. She became Mercury 7.5.
I felt it was an opportunity to try to convince them that a woman could do this type of thing and could do it well.
She actually went to the facilities where the Mercury 7 astronauts had been tested. Now, the other women, from Jerry Cobb to Wally Funk and the others, they were tested at the Loveless facility, but they never were associated with NASA. Those tests were not NASA initiated. They were private tests
We had to prove to them that girls could do it just as well or better than some of the guys. I thought I would go one day.
These other women were hoping that if they did well in their tests, that somehow there could be some influence to get women into the program. But Betty never had that illusion. That's where the disconnect gets in sometimes. The intent was to let's see how women stack up and how they do in these tests, and they did very well.
Those tests were a week long, and they checked every organ in my body. But the tests were to see how a person reacts to heaviness, sound, what's in your body. There was one test when they would inject water for 10 seconds in your ear. I said, oh, wow. And they said, are you okay? I said, yeah. Is that necessary?
Betty says in being in the centrifuge, she's spinning, and they say, well, what does that feel like? And she's like, well, that feels like a 1 or a 2 snap roll to the right. And then, oh, well, that feels like a snap roll to the left. And she gets it right away.
They have a test that stands you up on a platform and your feet are up in the air. And they couldn't figure out what for me to wear. So they decided to put me in a hospital gown because they'd never tested women before. And then somebody said, oh, I don't think that would work when she gets on this platform thing that goes upside down. So they put me in a pair of men's pajamas that were far too large. And I had forgotten to take shoes with me, so I wandered around the whole place the entire time in high-heel shoes.
That's the notion where she says, I know I don't belong here. They don't have shoes for me. They don't have clothes for me. There is nothing in this program that can accommodate a woman. And she understands that.
I felt that then was not really the total time for them to uproot everything that they were doing and the progress they had made to try to put a woman into the program. And I figured it would probably take 20 or 25 years due to the feeling about women anyway.
What an exclusive club. And the interesting part about this whole thing, Life magazine did a major piece on Betty, and then Look magazine countered with their own cover of Betty. And Look kind of put Betty into a little bit of a difficult position on that, because Look took the attitude that she was owed this position to be an 8th astronaut. And Betty felt that she wasn't owed anything.
It had to be a great sense of frustration for Betty to go through it knowing that she would never get chosen.
Betty, if nothing else, had a realistic attitude for the times.
It just was not to be, and I realized that. And so it was 59 to 99 before we could get a woman pilot commander. And in a way, it's like my dream come true.
A mission to space wasn't to be for Betty, but she wasn't finished making history. Her sights were set on going faster than any woman ever had. She'd conquer Bonneville.
Bonneville, Utah. Salt. Salt stretching as far as the eye can see.
Of all the things Betty Skelton has done, I can tell you the Bonneville thing is the one that blows me away the most.
By 1965, Betty was looking for new challenges and more speed. She headed to the Bonneville Salt Flats, where land speed kings had met their demise. Betty was undaunted and determined.
I wanted to go for a world's record. I'd like to have gone for a men's record, but there was nobody to let me have a car. And Art Arfonts, who had the Green Monster, Art said, well, you can drive my little Green Monster Cyclops.
People say, what's so hard to go straight? It is really hard.
The record in Art Arfon's Cyclops, which was a jet-powered dragster. Now that takes guts.
When you sit in the car, your fanny is only about 6 inches off the salt. And it's open cockpit, so as you're flying along, salt is flying in your face.
What are you feeling? You're bouncing around like that, and the car's moving all over.
The Bonneville salt flats are not the flattest surface necessarily, or the safest. The salt has all sorts of pitfalls and uneven surfaces. It's pretty damn tricky.
It is so hard to apply your skills as a race car driver when you go to Bonneville. It is more of a sake of courage. It is more a sake of trust, of your ability, of the car's capability, and you have to almost say safety out the window.
I was the first woman to go over 100, over 200, over 300. My top speed on the last run, I think, was 315 miles an hour. The car got airborne with me toward the end of the run, and I got it back on the ground, fortunately going the same direction it was going when it took off. Art was just scared to death, and I was just busy.
She had a close call at the end. The car got a little bit airborne, and our Fonz was very concerned. He couldn't see the car from his vantage point at the end of the run. He didn't know whether she had crashed or not. He had a really sick feeling that something had happened.
It was quite an experience. I had the flu at the time, and I felt I might have done better if I hadn't felt so badly.
She felt that when she was driving Cyclops, that she didn't have all the speed available to her that she really wanted. She felt that he'd kind of cut back on that a little bit. She wanted to go faster.
She wanted to run with the afterburner on. Art, I think, perhaps rightfully so, was a little concerned that that might be too fast to keep the car on the ground.
We were walking around the museum around Cyclops, and I'm like, look at this thing. What the hell is this? And she goes, oh, that Cyclops, I drove that at Bonneville. And I'm like, Betty, you're kidding.
I just can't imagine how she did that.
For 2 decades, Betty Skelton was a force that set the transportation and motorsports industry on a course for change. Even in her later years, she used her influence and credibility to advance women's opportunities.
We need leaders, and we need people that think outside the box, that don't follow the social norms, that do things for the first time, because it shows other people how to do things for the first time.
I think a lot of women probably did listen to her in subtle ways, you know? I mean, she wasn't writing treatises on equal rights, but she didn't need to. She was just doing it.
She was ahead of that. That's a little too angry for her. You know, we got to get what we deserve. And she was never like that. She knew when an opportunity was not going to happen. And so she didn't let that get her down. She just found another way around it.
Had she been a little more flamboyant and less careful in terms of what she said or how she drove or how she handled herself, she could have easily have put things back.
If she'd acted like that, or if she'd been, you know, an outward feminist, she would never have gotten that kind of respect. The men would have hated it.
You have to be twice as good. And she wasn't twice as good. She's probably 5 times better. But even then, the rules were, I'm sorry, can't allow any women. It was always, gentlemen, start your engines. Remember that? That's what they used to say. Then one year they could, what? We can't say that anymore? Oh.
Betty knew that she was even stronger playing a role behind the scenes where she could influence decisions and influence developments. She didn't need to be on camera to do that. She needed to be with those that were actually making decisions, using her influence as who she was to get things done and not just bring public awareness.
She certainly believes that women should be paid equally, should be able to have these opportunities. So she'll push that when she can.
She understood the times, and she understood the prejudices and the inequality of the sexes and so forth. We find it so outrageous today that I think the groundwork she laid was just invaluable.
Betty was very aware that she had succeeded and had pushed boundaries, and she was proud of that. And she was very happy then to have made that pathway for others to follow her.
Betty Skelton's accomplishments rewarded her with honors in 10 halls of fame, spanning aviation and motorsports. Her beloved plane, Little Stinker, hangs proudly in the entry of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, greeting visitors each day. Women have benefited from Betty's example. It is now our challenge to make sure she is never left behind.
I definitely was excited to meet Betty. When she came to Daytona to accept our Pioneer Award, she was an elderly woman, yes, but she was beautifully put together. The way she was dressed, her hair, her makeup, everything was just, like perfect. We gathered all of the gals together, and Betty came in. I introduced Betty to them and told them a little bit about her and that she was our Pioneer Award recipient. And she was lovely. I mean, these gals just all kind of circled around her, and she spoke to them. And I think it was when I handed her that trophy. When she said, "Thank you so much," I thought people had forgotten.